Animation is a staple of modern media. Almost everything from commercials, video games, shows, movies, and nowadays practically every live-action movie heavily uses CGI. But the medium has a very rich history that spans back over a century, all the way back to possibly the Stone Age with depictions of motion found in cave paintings. Even before the birth of cinema, there were many attempts to mimic motion in various ways. Flip books, the magic lantern, and a zoetrope. But what counts as a first true animated film gets a bit murky. The first candidate was made by a French man, Charles-Émile Reynad, as far back as 1888, which coincidentally is also the same year as the birth of film in general. He made a device called the feeder opaque. It works similar to projectors in the cell animation process that would follow in the coming decades, where hand-painted images would be projected and rotated through to give off the impression of motion. Unfortunately though, Charles went bankrupt later on in life and destroyed most of his films, with one of the few surviving being Poor Pete from 1892. This film I find very intriguing because of just how decent it looks despite being like 130 years old. The frames are well drawn, it's in color, and while a lot of the animation is a bit jittery, some parts have surprisingly fluent animation. And again, this was 1892. Very few films even exist around this time. We're talking maybe a few dozen tops. And most of them weren't really even movies, just a few seconds of some random thing being filmed. So it makes it even more impressive that Charles was able to make something like this. It was quite some time though before ever people started to try out animating themselves. It gets kind of hard to point out certain milestones this far back since a lot of films from the late 1800s and early 1900s are lost media nowadays. But the next animated film was created in 1900, The Enchanted Drawing, maybe, and it just barely counts as one. Made by J. Stuart Blackton, The Enchanted Drawing stars a cartoonist being able to sketch objects and bring them into the real world, and there's this weird creepy face. But it doesn't really count as animated, with things just jumping from pose to pose with no in-between frames. This is closer to stop motion if anything else. Blackton wasn't done yet though, as in 1906 he would create what many consider as the first true animated film. Since Charles' creations don't technically count as films as they don't use actual film. Humorous phases of funny faces. I don't really know how to describe this movie other than bizarre and kind of creepy, but at the same time kind of fascinating. Before computers, all animation was done by the cell animation process. Every frame of that animation was drawn on paper and then traced onto a sheet of plastic or a cell. And then that cell was painted, and then that cell was taken to a special camera, where it was placed onto a background cell along with cells of other moving objects within that frame. Then it was photographed, rinse and repeat again and again for thousands and thousands of times until the film or cartoon was finished. But in the super early days of animation before the invention of the cell process, animation was insanely hard to do. One of the big advantages of the cell animation process was only characters and objects in motion had to be redrawn for the next frame. But before that, everything, and I mean everything, had to be redrawn for the next frame, such as backgrounds. Because of this, these early films are extremely basic, primitive, and very surreal in a strange way that I can't describe. Humorous phases of funny phases was drawn onto a chalkboard and then photographed, which was a pretty ingenious way at the time to be able to change certain elements of each frame without having to redraw everything. Although there's still some debate on whether this counts as animation or stop motion, with certain scenes like this one with this clown and dog using cutout stop motion. Production aside, this is again very creepy and uncanny. The way things move, the creepy expressions, and how it utilizes real-world elements all make me feel uneasy. Then we arrive at Phantasmagoria, the first 100% definitely animated film. Created by Emile Cole in 1908, Phantasmagoria breaks a lot of ground. The art style is as primitive can be, yet it has a certain charm to it. The animation is incredibly fluent though, and it's all very creative in how it flows. In Japan around the same time, we got the first anime, which consists of a 4-second loop of a boy riding. The following decade, animation would start to become widespread, but not quite at the same level we see today. The animation industry in the 1910s was a decade unlike any other that's ever followed it. Most films were made by a single cartoonist or a small team, and because of that, the whole goal of producing one was to impress people, and not necessarily make a profit or tell a story. Surprisingly, many animated films of this era look pretty decent, at least in terms of like fluency and stuff like that. However, there is one cartoonist, one man, who made something so impressive, so groundbreaking and ahead of its time, that you could probably convince someone what he made came out in the 70s or 80s. This man was Winsor McCay, and his first ever cartoon, released all the way back in 1911, was Little Nemo. I cannot put into words how amazing this was for its time. Again, this was 1911. 1911, just 3 years before the First World War, 17 years before Steamboat Willie, and only a few years after the medium was invented, and we got this. Not only does it have complex character designs, not only is it in color, not only does it have incredibly fluent animation, not only does it have abstract movement, not only does it play with 3D perspective, but again, this was made by one guy. This was his first cartoon, and it was made all the way back in 1911. Honestly, McCay deserves to be remembered just as much as Walt Disney or Max Fleischer. McCay would later go on to make more films, although not quite as impressive as Little Nemo. Journey of a Dinosaur was the first movie to mix live action with animation, and on top of that, it has a background. This was made before the cell animation process, so McCay for every frame had to redraw these mountains, and he did so thousands of times. And he also had to make sure they looked roughly the same every single frame. Now that's some dedication. But McCay was more of the exception to the norm, and most animated films made by other studios and artists are quite primitive. They don't have quite as much movement, are kind of sloppy, but it's kind of understandable for the time and circumstances. After the First World War, the medium starts to shift away from the super primitive, surreal style, and shifts more towards the classic rubber hose era most of us are familiar with. New techniques like cell animation and rotoscoping took the medium in a completely different and new direction. In 1919, Pat Sullivan created Feline Follies, also known as Felix the Cat, the first cartoon that pop culture still remembers today somewhat, although it's a lot darker than you might remember, to say the least. Because it short ends in Felix committing suicide by asphyxiation, so yeah, that's kind of dark. Around the same time, Max Fleischer would create Out of the Inkwell, a series of short animated films that combine animation and live action. And to be honest, they still kind of hold up today, at least compared to everything else so far. Not only are these films impressive on a technical level, but enjoyable to watch when it comes to humor, getting a few chuckles out of me. Most of the other content so far doesn't really have much rhyme or reason, and the humor kind of falls flat nowadays. But Out of the Inkwell is pretty darn good, and honestly, in my personal opinion, was the start of a new era. By the early 20s, this weird, surreal, experimental era was completely over, and we begin to see the more professional and higher budget animated films with a lot of faces that are still widely known in pop culture today. But that's a story for another time.